Hey there, food fans. Welcome back to the Food for ThoughtCast with me, your host, Melissa Reagan. As always, you can call me Chef. I am honored today to bring you episode 25 of the Food for ThoughtCast. Today's episode is all about flavor, how to build them, where do you start, what flavors go with each other. This is part 2 of our taste and flavor combination. You see what I did there? You see? So I realized that at the beginning of every single episode, when I have a guest, I always ask them what the most amazing thing they ate this week was. But I never get to share it myself. And so while we're talking about creating flavors and building flavors, I want to tell you about some pasta that I made this week. I have been absolutely craving supreme pizza like Domino's or Cici's or even DiGiorno, just any type of supreme pizza. It has a very specific flavor profile. And if I close my eyes, I can taste it right on the tip of my tongue. If I close my eyes and think about it long enough, I can taste it and I can smell it. And I know exactly what it is. I've been craving it. I also have a problem with self-control. And to me, a piece of pizza is an entire pizza. You know, if you don't cut it, it's only a piece. I love pizza a lot, and let's face it, I just can't eat pizza all the time. I wish I could. I just don't have that metabolism. Nothing good ever comes out of me eating an entire pizza. So I decided I would use a little Bonza pasta. Bonza is the pasta that's made from garbanzo beans. You hear me talk about it every week. And it's really not for any other reason except for I love it so much. So I'm trying to spread the good word about Bonza. But I use this pasta. So right there, I've got a base. Pasta is not, incredibly unlike pizza crust. It's a base. It's like eggs or potatoes or bread. So it's a base, doesn't have a lot of flavor on its own. I started thinking about all the components of supreme pizza. Green peppers, black olives, red or white onions, depends on where you get it or what brand, right? What place you get it from. Typically Italian sausage. And then, tomato sauce, of course, and then mushrooms. So what did I do? I took a jar of pizza sauce. I took an onion, a green bell pepper, a tomato, pint of mushrooms, can of black olives, mixed all of that together. I happened to have everything on hand. I did not feel like going to the store to get Italian sausage. I had some vegan crumbles on hand. This is not vegan propaganda. I eat plant-based every once in a while. It's what I happen to have. So I know that the basic taste and flavors, right, of Italian sausage that kind of makes it different from breakfast sausage, for example. It's got fennel seed, it's got lots of oregano, and you have strong hits of garlic and onion. So I seasoned up the vegan crumbles, put all the sauce together, got the flavor just exactly where I wanted it, put it over pasta, and I put mozzarella cheese on it. Put it into a casserole dish, baked it in the oven until it was brown and bubbly. And let me tell you, it was every single thing that I wanted. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Creating those flavors, creating those combinations of flavors. Last week, we talked about taste, the 5 basic tastes, the 4 main ones, and the one newcomer to the crowd. That was salty, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami. We also discussed spicy just a bit, although it's a bit of an outlier. It's a combination of all of those things, plus the capsaicin present in peppers. But today, I want to talk to you about seasoning and creating flavors. Because remember, a flavor is the overall impression of a food. The flavor of a food is so much more than taste. It's so much more than just its single parts, right? The flavor can be the chemical components, the sensation on your tongue, the smell plays into this, the environment, the texture, right? The feel. The flavor is the entire experience, the whole package. So when we talk about creating flavors, you'll hear chefs or people in the industry a lot say that they like to build flavors or that it's necessary to build flavors on top of each other. So what does this mean? For example, if you're making a soup, for instance, you want to layer different flavors together. Let's say we're making chicken noodle soup. We'll make this a really simple example. for the sake of understanding this concept, right? So if we're making chicken noodle soup, we're going to start with our aromatics. What are aromatics? These are things like onions, celery, carrots, shallots, leeks, green onions, sometimes fennel, right? But these are kind of the more watery vegetables. They're going to be the base of, many dishes. You can saute them, you can sweat them, you can caramelize them, but what you're doing is you're starting that first layer of flavor. So you're going to want to season this component of our chicken noodle soup, right? You're going to use some salt, some pepper. You might throw a bay leaf in there, maybe a thyme sprig. This is the first layer of flavor, and you're going to build on this. Say if you wanted to add some root vegetables and make this a more hearty chicken noodle soup, right? Like the next step, you could add fennel, sweet potatoes, celeriac, something like that. And you could season it again because you want to build those layers. So that's not to say that you'll use the same amount of seasoning or salt and pepper for every single component of a dish, right? But definitely consider the fact that as you add ingredients to something that has multiple ingredients, you're spreading that salt out. You're diluting that flavor. You might even be watering it down. So what does this mean? So you've seasoned the aromatics, you've seasoned, the next round of ingredients that you're adding, which again is completely up to you, right? In this hypothetical chicken noodle soup that we're making. But in a restaurant, for instance, you would cook the noodles separately and you would add them as you served each portion, a cup or a bowl of soup, because if they sit in the soup for a really long time in bulk, then the noodles are going to act like a sponge. They're going to continue to cook in the hot liquid. They'll end up super mushy, they'll fall apart, and they'll kind of ruin the composition of the entire soup. At home, you could cook them in the broth as the last step of the soup, but you can also still get the same advantages as the restaurant method by cooking them separately and holding on to them until you've served it to everybody, right? And so when you talk about building layers of flavor, if you cook the noodles separately, you're still going to salt that water as well. And then the chicken that you're using, right? Like you want to add some flavor into that as well. You can consider doing something like using smoked chicken. You could use a rotisserie chicken that's been pre-seasoned. You could add chicken on its own. It would even be better if you marinate it in something beforehand. And then the liquid that you're using, you could choose broth or stock or a bouillon base, right? Instead of using regular water. So when you hear people talking about building layers of flavor, it's just putting that consideration into each step of the recipe. Now, I know there are some people out there who are going, but Melissa, isn't this going to make it salty? Well, not necessarily, right? You are going to season every single stage of a dish, or let's say you're making a salad. You're going to season each component separately, but appropriately. You're not going to use the same amount of salt or the same amount of seasoning for every single component. If we had a salad that had greens of some kind, let's say it had a lettuce base, and then you used a little cabbage, you might do something to that cabbage to make it more flavorful. You could marinate it. You could salt it beforehand to get it to release some of the juices and give it a little bit more flavor, and it would change the texture too. Because remember, flavor is that entire experience, and salt on its own isn't a flavor, but it's a flavor enhancer. And it acts on foods in a chemical way as well. It could make foods release their juices like eggplant and tomatoes, but it makes those things taste more flavorful. It makes those items taste more like themselves. It makes your tomatoes more tomatoey, right? It brings the sweetness out of fruits. So these are all things to consider when you are seasoning your food to build these flavors. Now, if you're on some sort of low sodium diet or you have completely gone off salt, I understand. And I think the same principles still apply even in those situations. So if you're using a salt substitute of some kind, which, I would steer you away, those things can have a really metallic aftertaste. I'm not a doctor. I've said it before. I'm not a dietitian. I don't have a nutrition degree, I can tell you how to make your food taste good. And if you need to go the healthy route, I can also tell you how to make it taste good, right? And that's kind of the point of these 2 episodes. But there are plenty of salt-free seasoning blends out there that are really fantastic. And this kind of logic, this strategy for building flavors applies the same way to those. If you're going to use saltier tasting foods like a hard cheese, capers, olives, things that can mimic the taste of salt, right? Strong acids, lemon, lime, bright tasting herbs like basil and dill and parsley and chervil, or other acids like vinegars, right? Or fermentation can even affect the saltiness of food. If you're going to use any of those things to create flavor, absolutely the same principle as if you're just using regular salt. You might ask, when is the best time to season foods? Well, if we're talking about steak or chickens or most proteins, I would say season these at least 24 hours in advance. Now, there are a couple of schools of thought out there, even among chefs, and there is a lot of disagreement to be found if you're looking for it. The idea is that you can season your meat up to 24 hours or even more in advance. It's going to bring different flavors to the front of your palate. For example, if you season chicken and steak 24 hours before, it's going to make them taste rich. It's going to balance these flavors and it'll make them more meaty. One school of thought on this, though, is that salt dries proteins out. But the reality is, from a science standpoint, and I talked about this last week, is that salt and water are always trying to equalize with each other. And I discussed this on our food terms episode as well, coming to terms part 1 and 2. When you're using a brine or a marinade, the liquid and the salt are trying to equalize across protein barriers. So that's why when you brine a turkey, it doesn't make it salty, of course, unless you use the wrong ratio of salt, but it makes it tender and juicy because it's forcing water across that membrane. A good rule of thumb for seasoning proteins is about 3/4 teaspoon of salt per pound of meat. Of course, I usually eyeball my seasonings. That's one reason I prefer to use something like kosher salt instead of iodized salt. It's not because I'm a salt snob. It's because I like to be able to see once I've salted something. I could literally forget 10 seconds later. If it's big enough granules of salt, I'll be able to see and feel if I've already done so. So it will prevent me from doing so twice, and it'll also help me, keep from oversalting something. The good thing is about a raw piece of meat is if you oversalt it, you can rinse it off or pat it dry and start over again. So when we talk about building flavors together, I used soup as an example. A salad is a great example. So if you talk about a mayonnaise-based salad, right? Tuna, egg salad, potato salad, there's a couple of different ways you can achieve flavor. In tuna salad, a lot of the saltiness is coming from maybe the juice from the tuna. A lot of it's going to be coming from the acid in the relish or chopped up pickles. If you're going that direction, remember there's that bitter kind of salty, sharp acid in onions. If you're a person who puts raw onion in tuna salad or egg salad or potato salad, you get that as well. Now, when you're talking about building flavor, something like potato salad, right? You would want to salt the water for the potatoes to get a little bit flavor in there, or use whatever you're going to use to season the potatoes, but you definitely want that done beforehand. Also, you can build the dressing separately, whether you're using mayonnaise as a base or yogurt. Maybe you're doing something vegan and you're using tofu, like a silken tofu or even veganese. You're going to want to flavor it beforehand to build those layers of flavor. It's the same thing with pasta salad. If you're cooking pasta either for hot or cold applications, really you should be salting the water so that it tastes like the ocean. If you're using a reduced sodium method or not eating salt for whatever reason, then you can season it afterwards with that alternative method. Now, I want to address a really common myth about flavoring beans specifically. You might have heard the old wives' tale that says if you salt bean water too early, they will never get soft. That is just not true, because the salt acts on the bean membranes much as it does like protein membranes. And so it's going to try to force water in. Not only will a little salt in the soaking liquid for beans soften the skins of the beans just a little bit, but it's another way to get flavor in there. The only thing that I'll caution you with for things like beans, potatoes, and pasta is once you've over salted, that's a thing that you really can't take out. You could possibly drain the beans and start all over again with the cooking liquid, but then you're going to lose all that beautiful work that you've done, to make it flavorful. Now, you might ask, when is the best time to add specific herbs and spices? So I want you to think about it like this. The heartier something is, the longer it will take to flavor the dish that it's in. And what I mean when I say this is if you're looking at an herb where you don't eat the stems, so that would be like rosemary, thyme, tarragon, for example, the things that you pick off the stems, oregano. If you're using those things fresh, you want to put them in at the beginning of the cooking process so that you can draw out all the flavors and the essential oils. These are like the woodier herbs, right? It has that woody stem that I guess you could eat it if you really wanted to, but like, why would you do that? If you're in need of fiber, just eat some bran cereal, right? But if you're going to use the dried version of those herbs, it's better to add them to dishes at the end. You need to rub those dried herbs between your hands to warm them and activate those essential oils. The drying of the herbs is just a preservation method. They're hibernating. They've been preserved to last longer. Now you have to wake them up so you can get the flavor out of them. This is a really good, chance to explain the concept of muddling in a cocktail, right? Like you're smashing those herbs to draw the flavors out. Anybody can put a parsley sprig on the edge of a plate. Anybody could garnish a glass of iced tea with a sprig of mint, but it's really a waste of time if you're not using it for its flavor. That same principle applies to when you're cooking with herbs. You want to make sure that you're adding dried herbs at the end and waking them back up. And you want to make sure that you're adding the woodier herbs at the beginning of the cooking process. Now, for brighter herbs that I already mentioned, right, when I was talking about things that can kind of mimic salt or brightness, bright flavors in food. So these like parsley, things with delicate leaves like parsley and dill and chervil and basil, right? These are things that you'll typically add at the end. So if you have a soup or a stew or a sauce, they could really benefit from a little greenery at the end. That's another way to brighten. You don't think of herbs as acidic, but that's how our brain processes that flavor. Green, bright, it comes across as acidic. Oftentimes be asked as a chef, how do you know which flavors go together? Or how do you know what goes with what? And to provide a little context, usually when somebody asks me this, it's because they're dealing with a pantry full of, misfits or odds and ends, or my friend John Sexton and I like to call bits and bobs. It's because they're looking at a freezer, a refrigerator, and a pantry full of things that don't go together, and they're trying to figure out how to work magic. That's altogether different from how do you know which flavors go best together. So what I mean by this is there are families of flavors, families of ingredients that create traditional and desired flavor experiences. So what we're talking about when we talk about this is like Italian, for example. You know that if you're going to eat something Italian, that you can expect basil, thyme, oregano, rosemary, sage, parsley, marjoram, bay leaves, right? You know that if you're eating Chinese food, whether it's traditional or Americanized, kind of the basis for the for the most traditional flavors are things like soy, rice wine, sesame, five spice, star anise, Sichuan peppercorn, oyster sauce. You know that if you're eating French cuisine, they're getting flavors from the actual ingredients themselves. There's not a lot of secondary flavors that go into here, but they're using things like wine, cheese, olive oil, seasonal vegetables, herbs de Provence, which is a blend, right? Tarragon, nutmeg. Very simple applications, very simple dishes where one item or two items can be the star of the show. Whereas if you're eating Indian food, you can expect to taste things like turmeric, cumin, cardamom, nutmeg, saffron, red chili powder, coriander, and garam masala. Whereas I really want to clear this up right now, curry powder is an invention of British India and has little to nothing to do with traditional Indian curry. It is a spice blend all on its own. But if you're at home and you're not making something that's Italian or Chinese or French or Indian, for example, how do you know what goes together? So I'm going to give you some basic guidelines that I think will really help you out. Meats like chicken, turkey, and pork tend to be the most versatile. These are meats that could take on any sort of flavor blend, spice blend, herbs, sauce, you name it. Very, very forgiving, very, very versatile. Beef tends to stand up to heartier flavors. You know, chicken you can do with something light, white wine, lemon, dill, basil, white pepper, black pepper. It's very forgiving. You can do almost everything with chicken. Whereas beef, you have a chance to expand those flavors just a little bit. It's hearty and it's meaty. It has the ability to stand up to things that are deeper and richer, more umami taste, right? So beef will really lend itself to things like red wine, coffee, Worcestershire sauce, barbecue sauce. Not that chicken doesn't go with barbecue sauce, but different types of barbecue sauce, right? If you have something coffee-based, something molasses-based, the beef flavor will stand up really, really, really well. If you're using wild game, like venison or boar or pheasant or quail, or even something like lamb, which is known to have a gamey flavor all of its own, gaminess in meat could be equated to acidity as a taste. Sour, right? It kind of tastes off. That's the thing that makes gamey meat taste different from domestic protein products. If you're thinking about that plus sign, right, that we have acid and sweet, which are kind of opposites of each other, not acid, but sour, excuse me. So if you have sour and sweet that are opposites of each other, and you have bitter and salty, or if you have bitter and sweet, right, and then you have umami somewhere in the vicinity of all four of those original tastes, right, you can think about it like this. I have turkey, which has a tendency to be a little bit sweeter. Now, what I mean by this is, you know, if you coat turkey with butter and you only salt it, it is going to hit the sweet part of your palate. If you go across that plus sign into sour, you know, a little sherry vinegar with turkey, a little balsamic vinegar with a chicken pasta, right? A little fig balsamic with a pork loin. Pork loin lends itself really well. Pork chops lend themselves really well to fruit accompaniments. The problem is that you can't just pair sweet fruits with meats without a sour component. You need a little balance, especially for meat that's not red meat or game meat, because it doesn't have the umami quality to stand up to it. I hope this is making sense. If you have a really fatty meat, you can offset some of that richness with acid. It's the same way that if you have something that's too fatty or too rich, you can offset the entire dish with a little bit of acid, maybe something spicy, maybe something a little bit salty to cut into that richness. It's absolutely the same method when you're trying to create flavors and figure out what goes together. If you have leftovers, think about the categories that these specific tastes fit into. If you have single ingredients, think about the categories that these single ingredients fit into. And if you have something that doesn't fit, maybe it's the basis of an entire dish. If you're trying to figure out what to do with rice and peaches and chicken, and you have a good, staple selection in your pantry, you have a lot of vinegars and condiments in your fridge, and you have some dried herbs, and maybe you have some fresh herbs in the fridge, right? You can think about it from the foundation of your knowledge about what the 5 tastes are, and you can go from there. Now, one of the best ways to figure out what goes with what is to taste every single ingredient on its own. Now, I'm not saying, eat raw chicken, right? I know there's going to be that one dude out there that's like, she said to taste everything by itself. Yeah, because believe it or not, I get messages. I get a couple every episode. It's a little bit ridiculous. Like, you got to use your brain. Home cooks, amateur cooks, if you want to call yourself a foodie, food fans, the flavor curious, our lovely voiceover artist says it at the beginning of every show. Flavor curious, right? You have to be curious. Try every spice on its own, just a little pinch to see what it tastes like. Where does it hit your tongue? What do you smell? What do you taste, right? Then think about the dishes you've had. Is there anything that you can replicate at home that you really like? Is there some sort of flavor combination that you can replicate at home? And at the end of the day, Google and your own experience are absolutely your best friend. You can think about the opposites. Opposites really do attract to each other when we're talking about taste. Sweet and sour. It's not just the name of delicious Americanized Chinese food, right? Sweet and sour chicken. It goes together. It's served in several places, and it's popular for a reason because those flavors work together. Think about umami and sweet. A really good example of this is teriyaki beef jerky, barbecued ribs, sweet and sour pork, right? Those meaty umami flavors with just a little bit of sweetness. A really good example of the way that the tastes work together to create an entire flavor experience is like when you put little smokies in grape jelly and mustard, or you put meatballs with cocktail sauce and brown sugar. The meatiness has to stand up to the sour, and it has to be balanced by the sweet. So when I say something like you can offset a dish that's too fatty with some acid, what I really mean is you can balance a dish that has a lot of umami flavor with some sour. All the tastes are always looking for balance. If you skew it one way or the other too far, it won't be enjoyable. This is why things like orange and chocolate work well together. It's bitter and sweet together. Cinnamon and coffee. Think about cream and coffee. Cream is fat. Coffee is bitter. Cabbage and onions, right? Greens and vinegar. Salty and sweet in any combination that you can imagine. It's not just because I like it, it's because it works. And there's something in our brain that tells us, hey, this is enjoyable. Things like chocolate covered pretzels, that's a salty and a sweet. Bacon wrapped dates, the umami from the bacon and the sweetness from the dates. So think about all the things in your kitchen from that foundation, and you can't go wrong. And listen, at the end of the day, there is a joy to not being paid to cook. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean. Because if your family's favorite combination turns out to be tomato, lime, and cinnamon, just as a weird example, it's weird to me. Maybe it's commonplace to somebody else. It's not something you would think goes together. But if that's something that your family likes, well, then so be it. There's really not a wrong answer here. So when people go, how do you know what goes together? How do you know what goes together? Trial and error. And I've learned a lot from cooking with other people, sitting at other people's tables, hearing their opinions, reading cookbooks, looking at recipes, right? I don't use recipes very often in the traditional senses. I don't follow a recipe, A, because I don't like following rules. I don't like being told what to do. And B, because a lot of the times I just see a recipe as a framework. It's just a set of guidelines. Now, if you're baking, you need a recipe because it's science and you need the proper ratios. It's very, very scientific, and maybe it won't work out if you don't follow the recipe, but cooking is altogether different. Our grandmothers taught us to cook a handful of this until it looks right, a pinch of that, enough of this to make it taste A, B, and C. We learn about flavor through the experiences that we go through. Eat a lot of food. Enjoy it. Eat as many foods as you can. Eat with your eyes. Learn about the food experiences of others. That's how you start to determine, what do I like? What do I not like? You can hear other people describe their favorite flavor combinations, and you can go, well, this has, lemon in it, which I'm not a fan of. Okay. Do you like other sour things? Play with ingredients. Don't be afraid to try a little bit. There's those stores that will sell items in bulk, so you can just buy a teeny tiny bit, right? And then you have the chance to experiment and see what you like best. Social media connects us in amazing ways. One of the things that I love to do is I love to go to Instagram and get inspired to try new flavor combinations. Everybody thinks, right? Like, you're a chef, you tried it all, you've seen it all. Nope, not even. I haven't even scratched the surface of what can be done when we're talking about taste and flavors. So I hope that you feel inspired. I hope that you feel encouraged. I hope that you feel like you have some knowledge to move forward, right? And go, okay, I know what these ingredients are. I know where they fit on this, taste spectrum. And now I kind of have this idea. Everything doesn't need a category. If you're cooking at home, you don't have to call it Tuscan or Asian or French. Not everything has to be inspired. The idea is that you feed yourself, you have a little fun, feed your family, right? That's the number one priority. Feed your family. But if you can make it enjoyable and if you can make it delicious, then that's just two things that you can put in the win column. I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode. Be sure to hit us up on Facebook and Instagram. Let us know what you're cooking. I always want to hear what you're cooking. I'm always happy to answer questions. This has been our 2-part episode on flavor and taste. As always, I hope you were entertained and educated as well. That's a wrap for today. Until the next episode of the Food for ThoughtCast, make good food, eat good food, share it, and be kind to one another.
Thanks so much for listening today. You are part of what makes us special, and we are so glad you joined us. Don't forget to rate, subscribe, and leave a review. Just like food, delicious podcasts are better when you share them with others. Come back for seconds wherever podcasts are served, and we'll catch you in the next episode of the Food for ThoughtCast.
You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at the Food for ThoughtCast or at www.foodforthoughtcast.com, where you can link to all podcast players, or you can send us an email at foodforthoughtcmc@gmail.com.